So last week, I had a chance to sit down with Paul from Apologia and talk through some of our favorite hot takes from Christian apologetics. And this is the second half of that conversation. So if you missed the first half, I will leave a link down below. I will also leave a link to an interview down below that I did with Paul on his channel. But in the meantime, we're ready for this. Let's go. This is part 2 of our favorite tropes or bad arguments of Christian apologetics. Go. Okay, so this next argument focuses on some of the things that happen in the Bible that can be historically verified. And this story, and I've heard it my whole life, it kind of goes like this. Scholars, it kind of ties into scholarship too. So scholars are out to disprove the Bible, but we have X new archaeological find that shows, for example, let's say Pilate, for example. So scholars doubted there was a Pilate, but now we have this inscription from Caesarea, talks about Pontius Pilate, proving that the Bible is the word of God and stands true no matter what scholars want to throw at it. Paul, what's your reaction to that?
Well, my reaction to that is one that typically apologists rail against and very much hate. Is in my community, we call this the Spider-Man fallacy, because the idea being, well, if you opened up a comic book and you saw, hey, Peter Parker is meeting Barack Obama, and Peter Parker is going to Times Square and to, buildings that exist in New York and the Statue of Liberty. Therefore, all of those things means that Spider-Man is real. For us is a equal parallel to trying to say that, because Quirinius was a governor and Herod was the king, and this is a town, and literally when we're saying that, they went up, we do the geography and it actually is uphill when it says we went up to a certain town. All those are just facts that are great, but they don't prove the supernatural claims, right? You don't look at a document that way. If I tell you a very detailed story about every left turn and right turn that I took to get to my local 7-Eleven, and it's accurate, and it talks about the guy who works there, and we all know this guy, but I talk about then the dragon in the parking lot. None of the detailed directions that I gave you about the rest of my day somehow corroborates the dragon part of the story, right?
I love that.
So,
I love the Spider-Man image. The image I had thought about this was like, if I wrote down a story about me drinking a Coke and then I saw an alien as I was drinking the Coke and I spit it out, and somebody, 1,000 years from now digs up a Coke can and it was like, Chris's story is right because we do have Coke. Like there really was a pop called Coca-Cola that they was drinking.
This is the level of, that is the level of corroboration. So of course it's a word in, I have some background in film and in fiction writing as well. And, the word is verisimilitude, right? You want to actually add details or the others. If you want to get worse about it, every lie has a kernel of truth, right? You actually, if you want to make an unbelievable story seem more grounded, then you put in as many details that are real and confirmable as possible. That's just the strategy to tricking maliciously or unintentionally. That's the way you make your story seem more believable, is by including details, even if they're embarrassing. These are all really just lending verisimilitude to your story, right? It's adding realistic details so that your brain will kind of categorize the large claim in with all those others, and in your head you're kind of like, well, he was right about 9 things, so maybe he's right about that 10th thing. And that is a frustration that I have. That also, the flip side of this is people who come at me and say, well, you are treating the Bible differently than I'm treating other ancient documents, right? You're treating it with different standards because when you see a historical document that says Caesar did this or Alexander the Great did that, you're not doubting each and every claim. And I actually say, well, I do treat them the same because crossing rivers is kind of mundane, and we know that armies take over different regions and that kind of things. But when it says, and then they became a god and ascended to heaven, that's the part of any story. I don't care if it's in the Bible or if it's in Tacitus's annals, or Tacitus, whoever wrote the annals, I forget the top of my head. Again, these are all different ways of looking at this whole fallacy that mundane details do not corroborate extraordinary details necessarily. So
there was an example that just rang a bell when you mentioned Suetonius, because there's an example in the Lives of the Caesars where I don't remember.
Thank you, Lives of the Caesars.
That's the Lives of Caesars. I don't remember which one it was, but I forget which Caesar. But he goes to Alexandria and spits in a blind man's eyes and heals his eyes. And I think another man touches his leg and he can't walk and he can walk or something. And yeah, I mean, nobody looks at these texts and is like, there really was an Alexandria, so this must be accurate. Like that's not the way we read ancient texts. And I think even even as somebody who identifies as a Christian, I think this just does a disservice. Like this is not the way anybody, even who believes, in supernatural things, which I'm pretty clear. Some days I don't, and some days I'm open to the idea. But it's not the way we read texts. Like no historians don't read texts like this. It's not like to be like there's these tiny bits of truth. And then the other thing I was going to say, because I was thinking about this, is like it's not even always about deception, on the part of these authors. Like sometimes they just didn't know. And one of the things that really struck me about Luke's geography, if you look at the geography in Luke Acts, we can sort of like identify that the author of Acts probably lived somewhere like in the Eastern Aegean, and probably did some sailing. And one of the ways we know that is because you get these really specific descriptions in Acts about like the winds were blowing this way and we took these, this trade wind and went up to here. I forget the exact details, but and then in Luke, when that presumably, arguably, the same author is talking about, the intricacies of the geography of Judea, it's kind of wrong, or it's vague, or like you don't get those specific details. So like clearly, it's just somebody needs to tell the story, and there are things that they're more comfortable with, but they're not going to stop and be like, and then Jesus walked around Israel, but Jesus walked around Judea. I don't know what it looked like, but he, so they make it up. Like they tell a story. They, famously, like in Mark, the famous example is like Jesus goes from like Caesarea up to like Sidon. He goes to like Caesarea to Galilee, like by way of Sidon, which is like, I don't know, a couple hundred kilometers out of the way, which is a long way to go if you're maybe walking. I don't know. So a lot of those types of things, it's like we could just see it as being an accident of history from somebody who probably didn't know we were going to read these books as closely as we do.
Well, or someone like me is going to say, well, the author of Luke Acts says up front that he's using sources, right?
Yeah,
he interviewed.
That's right.
He didn't say interview, but he's definitely using sources. So he also may have just found a travel diary.
Yeah.
Of a companion of Paul, and that explains the we passages, because he was, incorporating someone's travel diary who wasn't him. Like, I'm not saying definitively that is the case, but you have to at least put that on the table.
Yeah.
As a potential option. If you're going to say Luke used all these other sources, but no, that he definitely had to do that personally.
Yeah. It's the way scholarship
sure
works.
Why.
You have to consider it. Yeah. Oh, I have another one. Hopefully we can jump right in if it's okay with you, because as you say that, I'm thinking about eyewitnesses. And this is the thing. I did a video not too long ago in the Gospels, and I included this clip on J. Warner Wallace from J. Warner Wallace. We've already talked about him, but who says, the unique thing about Christianity is it's eyewitnesses. You don't get other religions like that. Christianity is eyewitnesses. Now, it's a lie to say you don't get other religions like that, but let's talk about the idea that Christianity is all by eyewitnesses, and therefore we can trust it. What would you say to that famous argument?
Well, of course, they want to go to the four Gospels. Generally, is the first thing, but they also might lean on Paul, and then those are kind of, to me, separate camps. If you're looking at the Gospels, though, as allegedly eyewitness testimony, they are problematically, as far as I'm concerned, at least internally anonymous. We don't know what might have been written on the scroll on the outside, or whatever, but internally, they don't claim to be eyewitnesses. Weird, the way John is actually written, it's a little bit weird that it's always third person. The disciple whom Jesus loved. We know that his testimony is true. Is the famous word at the end. Well, why are you saying he separately from we? Again, like, these are not. They don't claim to be eyewitnesses.
Yeah.
in the
Yeah.
book.
Yeah.
In fact, two of them, I think a lot of people sitting in the pews don't think about the fact that even if you accept the church father stories, Mark and Luke never would have even met Jesus, right?
Yeah. That's
The
right.
author of Mark, the other, if you accept traditional authorship,
Hmm.
so they're hearsay
Yeah.
at best, right? And of course, in court, we don't accept hearsay testimony. I do like that modern scholarship has then tried to identify things like creeds in 1 Corinthians 15, early Acts sermons, things like that. We identify, well, this must have come from earlier material. But when Paul is quoting in 1 Corinthians 15 about the 500 witnesses, and first we appeared to Cephas and then James, and 12, I think I'm getting the order mixed up, and then last of all to
Last
me.
one, me. Yeah.
Um, if indeed Paul is quoting that from something that goes, back to within 3 years of whatever, that's a whole dating of these things is a whole separate issue.
Yeah.
But that again is that's Paul's not an eyewitness to that. Paul
Yeah.
Paul is literally passing along what I received as of first importance, right?
Well,
So that's not eyewitness testimony, and whatever Paul saw
yeah.
can't have been, for most theologies, can't have been the actual body of Jesus, because Jesus talked about what was going to happen when he returned again. So if Jesus returned again in the same bodily form to appear to Paul, that means he broke a bunch of other prophecies about what was going to happen when he returned. So it had to be, at least in some different than the alleged visions of the others. So, I mean, I have long diatribes on whether or not these are witness testimonies. Let me pass it back to you for some of your thoughts.
That's fantastic. That's a lot of great stuff. I find, yeah, like it's a weird modern obsession that these be eyewitnesses. And it's just not something that apparently was even, I don't know. It's hard to even find that they were that concerned about calling these eyewitness accounts at the time. As you said, they wanted them to be accurate, and some people have interpreted that therefore means eyewitnesses. The statement at the beginning of Luke, it's hard to know exactly what he meant by it. I was going to say, the one thing that hit me last week, though, as I don't know if you do this too, but as I'm going, I'll sometimes be reflecting on like a video or a
Sure.
problem I'm thinking about or something, and I was thinking about like the ridiculousness of this trope is that nobody frankly gives a shit about eyewitnesses in any way, shape, or form. Like
Yep.
I can read, one of the things I read for my thesis for my PhD was it's by a writer named Lucian of Samosata. And it's called De Assyria. It's on the Syrian goddess. And he reports going to the sanctuary of the Syrian goddess. And I'm trying to remember exactly what part is his eyewitness. It's kind of like a travel journal, but like he reports that these people at the Syrian God have these experiences of like statues that sweat. And I'm trying to think, I'm going to mix up my sources, and this is embarrassing because it's in my PhD thesis, but I haven't looked at it in a long time.
If it's embarrassing,
But,
it's true.
yeah, if it's criterion of embarrassment. But anyways, let's say like I did study this cult, so I know this as a whole. I'm just trying to remember exactly which source is what. But like on the whole, they would say like statues would sweat and tremble, and people reported seeing this. So if I go to an apologist and say like, I have this ancient eyewitnesses who says that at the sanctuary of the Syrian goddess in Hierapolis in Syria, there were these statues that would tremble and sweat. Like, what do you say to that? Like, that must be true. That's an eyewitness. Like, no, of course not, right? Or I don't know if the Lives of the Caesars claims to be eyewitnesses, but the point is we discount like every other eyewitness testimony from antiquity. So like nobody actually really believes in eyewitnesses. And then I was thinking about this as like, I could take this one step further. You don't even care about Christian eyewitnesses outside of the canon. So like
Right.
in the like the famous martyrdom of Polycarp, apparently he died and like a dove flew out, and I think his blood maybe put out the fire. I'm trying to remember the details, but nobody's like, oh, eyewitness account. Like nobody wants to fight about that miracle. Or I've had one. I remember meeting a Greek Orthodox priest once who told me a story about a saint who got his head cut off, and then he kind of walked around carrying his head and preaching the gospel. I think this was in Paris. I'm a little rusty. Maybe I'll put the details down below if I can remember. But like we have these kind of eyewitness stories all throughout early Christianity. Eyewitness stories. Like nobody wants to argue that those are eyewitness accounts. It's like the gospels are unique, and is that because they're some kind of unique eyewitness status, or is it because we care about them more than everything else. And I think the answer is pretty clearly that we care about them more than everything else and want them to be eyewitnesses. So,
For me, this is adjacent to, it almost could be its own separate point, is abuse of Hume's on miracles. Because Hume famously wrote this, essay on miracles, and people get hung up on, well, his definition of miracle is wrong or whatever. But the takeaway and why people like Bert Ehrman or myself or a lot of people sound like we're quoting Hume, even though we don't really care, is that we're saying, well, no, testimony alone can't establish a miracle, right? Because even if you believe that miracles happen every day, there's a million miracles every day in the supernatural realm, that still doesn't mean that when someone, as you just said, when someone comes to you, a fellow brother or sister in Christ comes to you and describes a miracle you have, you actually don't necessarily immediately believe credulously that every single miracle claim is correct, right? Because you understand that some people lie, and that some people are sincerely mistaken, right? They're sincere, they're genuine, but they're attributing something incorrectly, right? And so those things are incredibly common. We know about lying and we know about being mistaken. And no matter what your worldview is, you would generally agree that those things happen more frequently than miracles do. And that's really all the Humean testimony claim is that if you're talking about only testimony without corroborating other things, it's more likely to be lying or mistaken. That's just, I mean, it's too bad, but that's just the reality of the world we live in, that we can't just elevate miracle claims. And so if you're a methodological naturalist like myself, then your prior for a miracle is very low, because I have yet to see one that I'm convinced was a real thing. So abuse of Hume is a subcategory of this testimony.
Well, if anyone's hung out with charismatics at all, which I have, I went through a charismatic phase. I wasn't personally that charismatic, but I was really drawn to it, and I was hoping that I would get all the gifts. It never really happened. Sorry to say, it never happened. But yeah, I mean, the amount of times that somebody came up to me and was like, God did this or God did that, and even as a fellow Christian, I was like, yeah, you're a little out to lunch, You're like, yeah, I don't know. I remember like one person telling me that they were at the Airport Church in Toronto, which is like a famous, like ridiculously charismatic church, and everyone was there, and this is the story this fellow Christian told me. We were there praying, and gold dust started falling from the ceiling, and we took this gold dust to this jeweler, and the jeweler said, we've never seen such quality of gold. This is like 100% gold. We've never seen this before. And even, I'm going to give every single evangelical watching this credit, because I think almost everybody knows that's bullshit, right? Like nobody's like, oh wow, there's something to that. Like, okay. Same thing with like other religions. You have Joseph Smith and the golden plates, apparently 12 eyewitnesses who signed their name to say that they saw these golden plates. And so eyewitnesses are at the root of the Mormon faith. Do you want to convert to Mormonism? Most evangelicals I know don't say yes. So yeah, it's a weird, like, that's kind of where I kept coming back to. It's like, we can fight about eyewitnesses and whether they were eyewitnesses, but the fact is, even if I give it to you that the Gospels were all eyewitness accounts, that doesn't mean that they are therefore unimpeachable, or we wouldn't.
Testimony alone is not sufficient to establish a miracle. Sorry.
That's right. Yeah. Notwithstanding the fact that J. Warner Wallace thinks that he could get them on the stand and get the truth.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. I guess that would be the other subcategory of complaint I have, which is that apologists tend to, within the Gospels, point to contradictions and their own harmonizations of what they call so-called contradictions, right?
Yeah.
I don't concern myself with contradictions. That's fine. Yeah. Harmonize all you want. For me, the biggest problem with saying this is eyewitness accounts is the collusion. The obvious Mark wrote his gospel first. If you accept basically any scholar in the world, almost
most people do. Yeah.
But if Matthew wrote Matthew, and the most important day of his life when he met Jesus, he's like, I'm writing this gospel. It's super important to me that I get my version out there. But the day I meet Jesus, you know what? I'm just going to copy that word for word from a book from someone who wasn't there, and also not use the even first person pronouns. I'm going to refer to myself as Matthew in the third person, and I'm
Yeah.
not going to add a single detail about how it made me feel or whatever. It's like, no, that's, to me, that's the problematic part that tells me it's not eyewitnesses, because these
Yeah.
are, he didn't add any of his own details in the stories about himself.
Paul, Jesus either was who he said he was, so he was either a
Oh
loony,
no.
he
Oh
was a
no.
liar, or he's Lord. Paul, what do you say to this? Either who was who he says he was, or he was crazy, or he was a liar. We have no evidence that he was crazy from these eyewitnesses. We have no evidence that he tried to lie. So therefore, he must be the second person of the Trinity.
Paul, are you smarter than C.S. Lewis, the author of Mere Christianity? Um, yeah, the liar, lunatic, Lord trilemma, of course, these are only, it's a false trilemma because these are not the only options. Of course, for me, and I like to borrow from Bert Ehrman here, liar, lunatic, Lord, or legend. Perhaps he didn't actually say any of the things that are attributed to him. Therefore, if he didn't say that he was God, or if he didn't make any of those other claims, then he need not be any of those other things. So yeah, it's a false trilemma. It drives me crazy. I, in my view, the Gospels may well contain historical kernels here and there, but these were, to me, obviously stories that developed in the decades between when the events allegedly happened and when the first gospel was written down. Whether you think it was in 40 A.D., like J. Warner Wallace thinks, or in 70 A.D., like most scholars say, there's still decades there with which for these stories to grow. So legend is an option on the table, and perhaps you have other options you can put on the table.
That's absolutely right. Couldn't have said it better myself. There's obviously we have to believe like that the things Jesus says in the Gospels are straight from Jesus' mouth, and these are not video cameras. These are like
That's right.
the even the Lord part. It's not like that's kind of church theology that would develop over time. It's not inherently well, that's not entirely true. I don't want to oversell this point because Paul obviously calls Jesus Lord, and apparently it's an early Christian hymn, and so there's obviously something there, but the amount to which like most people hear Jesus as Lord and they're thinking about like the second person of the Trinity, and that kind of theological work took some time to develop too. It wasn't just
For
something.
sure. And I was just going to add, by the way, if you're hoping to save me, if you want me to reconvert to Christianity, sending me another copy of Mere Christianity isn't going to do it. I have so many on my that I've redonated back into the society because for some reason people think that book alone is going to do it. No, just pray for me instead. Pray that I will receive the Holy Spirit because and save your few dollars.
I'm trying to think, like Mere Christianity was quite a letdown actually, even as a Christian when I read it. It was like, yeah, I get it. Like natural law. There's like theologians like what's his name? I think Alistair McIntyre just recently died, who was like famous for natural law theory and like pushing away virtue theory. I was never great with ethics, but I read some of this stuff. But yeah, I don't know if C.S. Lewis was really I think he's a level that evangelicals understand, but that sounds bad to say, but I don't really think he's the bright, shining intellectual light people want him to be.
No, and I do sometimes wonder if his stuff would be so revered if he hadn't also written Chronicles of Narnia, which was brilliant.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah. Well, that's the thing.
So,
like as an author, like as a fiction writer, he was obviously very gifted. Like I love his writings, but
and his rhetorical work, if you listen to him just on the radio, like he would have been one of the first apologists, right? One of the first public apologists, because he was doing radio interviews and out there doing that. And so his rhetorical work, though it would definitely fell into all the categories that we've talked about here, all the same fallacies, all the same problems. He was a gifted orator and a sharp mind. But yeah, I do wonder sometimes if you didn't have the Narnia stuff to go back on, would Screwtape Letters and Mere Christianity and some of those other theological works be so popular today? Not sure.
I think a lot of that stuff even provided an emotional framework for a lot of evangelicals to think about Christianity, like the idea of Aslan and this like lion, gentle giant. Like I think for a lot of people that almost, I could see it being scriptural in 1,000 years, if maybe it'll be added to a canon at some point, but like it's powerful. That's right. There's a lot of powerful emotional like imagery, metaphors. Like it's really good literature. It just he wasn't necessarily the best kind of philosopher, I would say.
Right. It's kind of like when Jude quotes, pretty much get this wrong, but I think Jude quotes Enoch, right?
Yeah.
Or
Yeah.
something. If a canonical book someday quotes Narnia, I could see that happening, right? It's like, well, okay, Narnia didn't become canonical, but it was referenced canonically.
Paul, there are a lot of things when I study Christianity that I see. For example, Paul doesn't seem to know about the virgin birth, just for an example. And I mean, we could pick a lot of different things from the New Testament that, it doesn't always seem like people know things. But absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, or you're making an argument from silence is the other way to say this, and you can't make arguments from silence. What would you say to that?
I would say in general that arguments from silence, one should always be wary. A lot of times it is actually completely invalid. There is the weird case, though, where an argument from silence can have some weight if there is good reason to expect that that should have existed if the claim is true, right? So it's very tough to say that Paul necessarily would have known the details about virgin birth, right? And that's an acceptable argument from silence. But there are certain things like, for example, for someone like me, if the story in Matthew that the saints rose and wandered around town, many of them rose, it seems to me like a secular historian living in Jerusalem during the busy Passover time, there were plenty of non-Jews living in town at the time, that if there was many saints risen from the dead, and it seems like that would come up, or the darkness or the tearing of the cloth, right? These are all things. It seems like no Jewish, non-Christian Jewish scholar actually talks about the torn curtain, right? Like that doesn't ever come up. So it seems like that is actually something I would expect to see in the literature. The other thing that drives me crazy in this category is I can say confidently that all 11 of the 12 were out preaching because there's no record of them recanting. They didn't recant, therefore they must have been out preaching. And of course there's plenty of other options than that, but at the same time we also don't have any story of someone asking them to recant, and they do hold on to their faith, right? So the argument from silence cuts both ways when it comes to disciples recanting. Both are an argument from silence, and then it's just up to the listener to decide, well, which of these would I expect to be maintained? Or why were there not other movements like the Jesus movement that caught on, since there were other messiahs? And it's like, kind of, well, history is written by the victor. We are not going to be duplicating. Christians for centuries aren't going to be writing down stories of say Thomas, who was wandering around town saying, I never put my finger in anyone's side. If he was wandering around town Jerusalem saying that loudly, we don't expect that story was going to be kept and preserved by the Christian victors. So these are all parts of it, and I forget whether I covered or not why these are fallacies. I will hand it back to you. Did I?
Yeah. Well, no,
Did I cover that?
Yeah, I think so. I think that's good. I made a video on this at one point too, because it had bugged me a lot because people kept saying it to me anytime I talked about the Gospels. So I made a similar video. But I was thinking, like, if you go to the doctor and they think you might have cancer or something, and they run a lot of tests and they don't find anything, like, at some point that is evidence. That absence of evidence is clearly evidence. It might not be completely conclusive. It might not be like absolute proof, but it is evidence. And exactly what you said, I think it cuts both ways, because there's a lot of like crazy conspiracy theories out there that I hear about, the Christian origins, that I discount as well for absence of evidence. So just for an example, the famous one is John Marco Allegro's idea about the mushroom cult, that basically all Jesus followers were, well, I think he doesn't actually say Jesus existed. I think he just says it's all about like following a sacred mushroom, and these people were essentially high. And I say there's not evidence for that. Like, it's a really interesting theory. If you can bring me some evidence, I'd be interested to see it. But so it cuts both ways. So it's not like you can't have your cake and eat it too, or in this case, it's absence of evidence is absolutely evidence, and that's just, every field works like that. Absence of evidence is always evidence.
anytime you hear a scholar or an apologist say we can infer X or infer Y, in some ways they're admitting some silence, right? Because they're saying, well, it isn't actually blatantly said. So, for example, again, 1 Corinthians 15 Creed, where Paul merely says that Jesus was buried.
Mm.
And everyone's like, well, that means Paul affirms the tomb. Well, no, he doesn't. Because the Greek word atepe there is used both for everything from discarded in a ditch by the side of the road to the grandest king in a pyramid, right? Like it's the same word buried gets used for all those. So it is, I mean, is it a reasonable inference? Sure. But every inference is always in some way its own argument from silence. And what you're actually appealing to is what would we expect to say? And as much as I'm loath to lean heavily on the work of Dr. Lydia McGrew, she does give a great example of, the fact that I don't see a tiger in my room is pretty good evidence there's not a tiger in my room. But the fact that I don't see a mosquito or a fly in my room is actually less evidence that there's maybe a mosquito or a fly in my room, just because of what your expectations would be or how obvious it would be. And I actually think that's a reasonably good example of that there's a spectrum here on argument from silence.
Okay, so Paul, I just want to thank you so much for joining me today. This was a lot of fun. I know people probably know where to find you, and your handle speaks for itself. But let's just throw it out there just before we end. So where can people find you?
Mostly on YouTube at Apologia, Paulogia, which is a play on the words apologia or apologia, as my Western Canadian Bible College called it, which is why I pronounce it weird, perhaps. But to always give it offense, I like to say that I'm the former Christian looking at the claims of Christians. So find me here on YouTube.
Awesome. Thank you so much for joining me today, Paul.
Appreciate it.
I could frame this as like the screw tape letters that like I'm the junior devil and you're the senior devil, and like I'm trying to get your help, trying to get better. Okay.
I mean, just a few years ago, I thought dinosaurs were on the ark, so you could only go so far.
They weren't? Before God's Not Dead ever came out, we used to tell a story about a philosophy professor who said, you can't prove there's a God. And a student stands up and says, has anyone ever seen the professor's brain? Therefore, you can't prove the professor has a brain. Do you remember this story?
I have absolutely heard that slam dunk mic drop before anyone was saying the phrase mic drop. Yes, absolutely.
Exactly. So I haven't seen this movie. I like sort of saw a bit of God's Not Dead 1. I didn't see the second one. Is this Lee Strobel and J. Warner Wallace?
It is correct. That's who they call to the witness stand.
Of course. Expert eyewitnesses.